Great, good afternoon, everyone. What a turnout for a policy research report. Thank you all so much for coming. Welcome to Annapolis, welcome to the Treasury Building. For those of you who haven't been here before, this is where the magic happens. This is where your taxes get collected. It's also where your refunds go out from, so welcome. My name's Ben Seigel. I'm the Deputy Comptroller for Policy, Public Works, and Investment with the Maryland Comptroller's Office, and I'm here to welcome you to today's event, give a brief introduction before turning it over to our Comptroller and Housing Secretary to get us started with a fireside chat. So why are we here today? We are here launching a new report on housing and the economy in Maryland that we just put out today. We're going to spend today with a fireside chat and then with a panel of experts talking about some of the key themes and findings from the report. We're also going to be talking about another report that DHCD, Housing and Community Development, put out earlier this year on the Housing Needs Assessment Update. Combined, these reports are about 300 pages. We don't expect you to read them all right now, all those pages. It's in part why we have the Smith Island cake in the back to help keep you awake throughout. But there's other reasons that we serve the cake as well. We also wanted to bring this group together today because so many of you were instrumental to our work in putting this report together. In addition to doing a significant amount of data analysis, we talked to 200 folks from across the state in roundtables, online, in interviews, and those conversations with developers, with housing and planning officials at the state and local level, with housing advocates, with homeowners, with renters, was really critical in providing qualitative data to us to help match up the quantitative data. So we want to acknowledge your support. And also, the folks in this room are the ones who are going to get it done, right? We are in a monumental housing crisis, as we talk about in the report. Obviously, solutions will come from the state level, from the local level, certainly from the private sector, but it's really all of you who are in this space who's going to help us with our affordability challenge, as well as with our production challenge. So just briefly about the report. This report is part of a series of reports that we've been doing out of the Comptroller's Office going back to January of 2024 on the state of the economy in Maryland. This series is looking at some of the key headwinds and tailwinds that our economy has been facing in recent years, kind of dating before the pandemic, during, and just after the pandemic, especially relating to things like domestic migration and how Maryland is affected by folks moving in and out of the state, as well as key areas like our labor force participation rate and how those headwinds, tailwinds affect our economy and ultimately for us in the Comptroller's Office, our revenues and our economic outlook. We've done a couple of reports to date. As part of this series, we did one last year on immigration and the economy, and at the end of last year, we did one on childcare and labor force participation. And this one on housing and the economy is the third report in our series. Just very quickly, the report presents data on migration trends, housing costs, and the supply and demand of housing in Maryland compared to states where we lose residents as well as states where we gain residents. We also, in this report, section 4, that's the real meaty section, we detail the key regulatory, policy, and administrative factors that constrain supply and also drive up costs of housing here in Maryland. And we do some comparisons with other states and how we differ in terms of our regulatory framework and are similar. I'm just going to share 2 quick slides from the report, and then we're going to jump into our fireside chat here. The first slide is actually one of the handouts that we gave you. In case you can't see it up here, you have it in front of you. This is just to point out one of the kind of core findings and really the launching point of this report, and it's looking at domestic migration patterns in recent years. So this is where are people moving from into Maryland, and where are Marylanders moving out to other states? And the top states are where we get more people on net. So that's DC, New York, New Jersey, and then these bottom states are the top states where we're losing people. on net. Florida, the Carolinas, Texas, Pennsylvania, Virginia, you can see. Now, if you look closely at the numbers, what's really interesting and maybe to be expected here is that these migration patterns perfectly align with housing costs and housing supply. So the states where we gain residents from have higher housing costs in terms of ownership and rental, and also have been producing less housing. But then the states where we're losing more people have lower housing costs and have had greater production. So you can see the trend here, and it's part of a national trend around affordability, where people are moving from higher cost to lower cost of living states, and housing is really that number one factor when it comes to affordability. Okay, and now for the second slide and key point from the report, and this is our Smith Island cake. So we brought props that are edible in the back. Hopefully everyone got some. For those of you in the room, this is not something we coined, but as part of our roundtables talking with folks across the state, our famous state dessert, the Smith Island cake, came up a number of times as an apt analogy to the regulatory framework in Maryland as it relates to residential development. And the idea here is that all of those yummy layers of Smith Island cake kind of represent all of our layers of regulation. And you know, the way that we talk about in the report, you know, many folks in the room are well aware, it's not that it's any one regulation or policy or process that kind of trips people up, but when you take the aggregate of them, the combined list of regulations, federal, state, local, policies, fees, permitting, all of that, it really adds up. And at the end of the day, you know, that creates costs, that creates time delays, and that ultimately affects our ability to be really efficient and reach the scale we need to reach with housing production. So with that, I think you'll probably hear about Smith Island cake a few more times throughout today. We are going to have our fireside chat first with Secretary Day and Comptroller Lierman. Then we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to move the chairs off the stage here and move into a panel with experts. So you will get a short break after they go. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of cake left, and then we'll come back for our panel. So without further ado, let me call in Comptroller Lierman and Secretary Day to get our fireside chat started.
Thank you so much, Ben. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Treasury Building of Maryland, the Goldstein Treasury Building of Maryland, excuse me. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thanks so much for prioritizing this. And thank you, so many of you were instrumental in putting this report together. So thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about your experiences, your thoughts, your diagnoses. We couldn't have done this report without you. I'm really grateful to Ben and Dani and the whole team of people who put this together, but you were also instrumental, so thank you. And thank you, Secretary Day. It's great to have you here. Welcome.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me in the Goldstein Treasury Building, Madam Comptroller. It's also so great to be in a room full of so many familiar faces. So good to be with friends to have this conversation. And I love your fireplaces.
Yes. Well, you know, it's a little warm in here, so we just wanted to, you know, continue the ambiance. But it is, so we will jump in, and I'm going to talk sort of a little bit about the report, and then have a conversation about some of the things that we're seeing, and then, of course, from the DHCD side as well. So in the report, we look at the relationship between domestic migration and housing. And this was really previewed or initially discussed in our State of the Economy report several years ago. And since then, we have been digging into different topics that we started there, and this is our latest one. So we do find that Maryland has experienced net domestic outmigration since 2012. That is people moving from Maryland to other lower cost of living states. And it's interesting because before the pandemic, this was really older people, right? We were losing on a net basis sort of older and higher income folks. Maybe they were retirees, motivated by better weather, or no or very low income taxes. But since the pandemic, we've seen sort of a troubling new trend. And that is that Maryland is losing even more residents to other states, a net of 40,000 per year on average. but we're seeing an increase in younger people and middle and lower income households leaving the state. These folks seem to be motivated not as much by warmer weather or worse government in Florida, but looking for a lower cost of living. And the top expense category for cost of living, of course, is housing. So when we're talking about how much it costs to live someplace, we have to just take on housing. When you look at the states that Maryland gains residents from, New York, New Jersey, DC, which should be a state, and recently California, and the states where we lose residents to, Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Delaware, and West Virginia, the common denominator is housing costs. We gain people from states with higher housing costs, and we lose people to states with lower housing costs. So, I want to turn it over to Secretary Day now to talk a little bit and just share sort of your perspective on these migration patterns and what it tells you about housing affordability in Maryland.
Well, Comptroller, let me start off by saying that I'm so grateful to have you and your team analyzing and sharing the results of this analysis on the subject of housing. There's no doubt that this is something that every single Maryland family is concerned about, cares about. We see it time and again. We've seen it in the Maryland Association of Realtors polling, Greater Washington, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and so on and so forth. People are concerned, and costs continue to rise. So when I see the migration patterns, I have kind of two thoughts. Number one, I believe firmly, and I believed this when I was a local elected official, that if you're not growing, you're dying. There is no stasis in population. There is no stasis in economy. There is no stasis in place. If you are not growing, your costs are still growing. Your maintenance responsibilities are still growing and largely getting out of hand. And everything's getting more expensive thanks to inflation and supply chain challenges. And so growth is a necessary response to the desire, the aspirations that we have. I was on a call with County Executive Stuart Pittman and Annapolis Mayor Buckley earlier today, and they talked about their aspirations for their community. And there wasn't a single one of them that was free. All of those things cost money. The second thought I have is this, is that we're talking about growth patterns. And we also have had conversations in the state about housing targets, growth targets. And I think it's really fundamental that we remember this. There is no one that moves to a housing policy. There is no one that moves to a housing permit. People move into homes. And so the homes have to exist for people to choose a place. There's really no chicken and egg debate to be had. We have to have the homes for people to choose the place. And so making it easier to build housing is the only thing that will result in the population growth objectives that we have.
Yeah, really well said. And, especially on that first point, I think it's worth just underscoring, I live in Baltimore City, as most of you know. We have our housing commissioner here. And, one of the things that is sort of constantly talked about in Baltimore since I moved there, over 15 years ago was what is happening with our population. We are obsessed with whether we're growing or stagnant or declining. And this past spring, I remember had been a particularly bad week of news. And then all of a sudden a story popped up on the front page that said Baltimore City gained residents for the first time in a decade. And I think I let out a woohoo, it is really important that but we never talk about it in that way as a state, right? And so I do think you're totally right. There is no stasis. We have to keep moving forward, and it has to really, I think it more than it has been in the past, needs to drive some of our conversations around policy, right?
I think we are super interested in measuring outcomes, but it's one of those outcomes that we often act as if we have no control over and we're just subject to the trends. But no,
that is not the case.
I think it is the most fundamental measurement of success.
If what you are doing is not drawing people there and keeping people there, then perhaps it's important to think about changing what you're doing.
People vote with their feet.
They do. So, yep. And in your agency's recent housing needs assessment, which we have here, you find that we actually have a current shortage of 100,000 housing units in Maryland that will escalate to 500,000 more units being needed in about 20 years. We also found that today only 50% of Marylanders earn enough money to afford a median priced home in the state. 20 years ago, that number was 75%. So that's a big drop and puts a lot of pressure on the rental market. It does seem like one of our challenges is that we don't have enough of what everyone calls now this term, the missing middle housing, right? It's the more affordable duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, row homes, whatever you want to call them. They tend to be more affordable and make great starter homes. Or like me, I live in a row home and I will die in a row home. I am not interested in mowing a yard. I did that my whole teenage years. So in some of our metro areas, only 30% of residential land allows for duplexes. And we found that in some of the growing metro areas in North Carolina, more than 80% of residential land allows for duplexes. Also not lost on me that medium and higher density housing is better for the environment, right? And it helps us meet our state climate goals more so than having the low density single family homes. So what are we missing here in Maryland? What's your perspective and what are you focused on from the DHCD side of things?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that this topic is one that we're spending time talking about. Look, we have a really fantastic policy team. Front row here is Scott Gottbrett, our Assistant Secretary of Policy, and one of the first things we did when we came into office was just looked at the landscape, look around the country and see what other places are doing. And many states are tackling this issue. They're all acknowledging what you just hit on, which is that fundamentally housing is built on land. And so we have a limited resource. And so how we constrain what may happen on that land is going to shape the marketplace. And ultimately, supply and demand is going to affect affordability and price. And so I think we have to take into account, our zoning as a fundamental part of the way that we constrain and affect what will get built and what its value is going to be and what its price is going to be on the market. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean we have to think about changing zoning from conserved land to high density residential, right? I mean, this
Exactly.
is, as you said, the missing middle. We ought to be thinking about the lots that have become unbuildable because of zoning. I mean, let's also just look out the window here. One of the great American cities, one of the great walkable places in this country is right around us in the city of Annapolis. Beautiful. And you know what we have largely done in this country? Outlawed places like this. Made it illegal to build places like this. And so we have no one to blame but us. Government has created that dynamic. And so as much as I hate mowing a lawn too, it's
People want it. I get that. That's fine.
some people want it, but we have artificially restricted it with government regulations.
Yeah, no, really well said. So let's talk about what those government regulations are, right? Why have we done that? Why has it become so hard to build housing that's affordable in Maryland? And I also think it's important to clarify, we are talking about building housing that is affordable in Maryland, not just for 10 to 60% AMI, but for above that as well, 80% AMI, 100% AMI. This is for everybody. And I think traditionally when we said affordable housing, it meant something very specific, like public housing. That's not what we mean anymore. When we say affordable housing, it's like what the normal family could actually afford, who are all working and doing well. But let's talk a little bit about this is complicated factors. Thankfully, we have a state dessert that we can compare it to. And we do acknowledge, there's density, zoning, other land use regulations, permitting, vesting, inefficient processes, also lack of infrastructure, right, that supports new homes. But let's first talk about density, zoning, and land use regulations. And you saw the nice chart, our Smith Island cake here, and talking about the Smith Island cake effect in the report, which refers to the many layers of regulations across multiple levels of government and challenges that governments have in even administering those, because it becomes really challenging. And then home builders, developers, nonprofit and for-profit alike have in navigating the landscape. And, I think one of the things that's interesting to me as somebody who used to, make policy and pass bills is that every one of these came from a thoughtful place, right? They have a meaning, they have a reason, but really what's become challenging is just this whole having the gestalt effect of all of the regulations together. So talk to us a little bit about the Smith Island cake effect and your view on it.
I want to start off by noting, I'm going to turn just a little bit and pointing out that I wore a Smith Island cake pin for you today.
Yes, thank you.
You know,
I didn't know they made those before.
In
now
part
I know.
because of the Smith Island cake effect, but also because I heard you say the other day that you think Smith Island cake should be served in any meeting, and you've been true to your word.
We have it here.
True to your word. I appreciate that. So yeah, I have a couple of thoughts here. Look, as you said, good intention was the underlying reason behind whatever policy exists today. But as they layer, they do have an effect on other aspects of society and life. And I think it is just as legitimate a public policy outcome to try to address affordability for our residents. And that begs us to reconsider what we have created. That there is an imperative to review the value of addressing affordability. I think that was probably a low priority, or the effect was imagined to be negligible.
Right.
And today we have seen that, over time we have built something, a construct that isn't working for us. It's not working for the average Maryland family. I also want to say that to your point about affordability, we talk about lowercase a affordable housing versus uppercase a affordable housing, but what is affordable to people runs into this real challenge. I think it's a messaging challenge as much as anything, is that people see housing getting built and they say it's not making anything cheaper. But what they're observing is the only things that have gotten through cumbersome regulatory process.
That's true.
And ultimately, it's got to either break even for a nonprofit or it's got to be profitable or nobody's going to build it.
Right.
Nobody's building. There is not a soul, even the best intentioned people, who is out there building housing just because they feel good about it. It's got to at least break even with subsidy. It's got to break even. And so we see luxury apartments, we see McMansions, and people are mad about that, understandably so. But what I would say is if we are able to successfully address the regulatory obstacles and the effect of the Smith Island cake effect, then what I think we will see as a result is more affordable, lowercase a affordable housing up and down the market, which will enable a lot of mobility throughout the market.
That's really interesting, and I think that's a great way of explaining it. There's also the challenge of sort of permitting, vesting, process inefficiencies. And, I think one of the things it's important for everybody to remember, too, is that on the other side of all of these are government officials who are trying to do the right thing and trying to carry out the regulations that have been found or that have been passed. They're doing the best that they can, and there aren't enough government officials, right? It's the same here in the office of the Comptroller, right? More and more complicated tax policy means harder and harder to administer, means, people wait, more people have to call in, we don't have enough staff to so all of this means that it's harder to get through and that it's harder for things to get done. And one of the things that we found, because of course, I think one of the things that I really like about this report is we don't talk about Maryland in a vacuum, right? We don't exist in a vacuum, so we talk about how we compare to all the other states. And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes this report from some of the other reports I've seen. And one of the things we found is that we are a very late vesting state, right? Which means that projects are not protected or grandfathered from any change in zoning, land use, regulation until all the building permits are secured and construction is underway. That is very different than our neighboring states in Virginia and Delaware, where vesting occurs earlier. So my understanding is that, then investors feel more secure that their investment is safe and they're more willing to make that bet. So it's easier to build the capital stack to build the housing. So talk to me a little bit about some of these processes that you're seeing and what you're doing.
I'll talk about a couple of them, but let's start with vesting. Let's remember that that the policy framework that we build for anything is a fabrication, right? We're creating this, and it ought to reflect something. I think one of the things that ought to reflect is our values. And so when we build a policy framework that says we will write down rules in black and white. We will publish that as Maryland law and regulation. And we will hold you to that, and you must build to that. But we can change it after you apply. It's not fair. It's wrong. It's simply wrong. And so forget the effect on whether or not investors have a reliable marketplace and can predict outcomes. They can't. They can't. But on top of that, it doesn't reflect who we are as a state, as a people. So I think there's a real problem with that. Number two, on permitting, look, I go back to my time as a mayor and think about how we consolidated and redesigned permitting processes from 7 departments you had to go to, independent, each with their own personality, each with their own leadership, to build any one thing. 7 different agencies, and we consolidated that and redesigned the process. I think about our work, Commissioner Kennedy, our work around vacancy in Baltimore City, and how we're critically assessing process flow and how a property goes from the identification that it might be vacant to ultimately a determination that it is, to how are we going to get it, to how are we going to make it abated and produce an outcome for that neighborhood. You have to think critically about process, map it, diagram it, and chip away at it. And the governor's Housing Starts Here executive order that he recently signed does that with state government in mind, recognizing that, by the way, this often gets cast as like a local government problem. Let's not forget, state government, we have a role in permitting too.
Totally.
And so, for agencies like the Maryland Department of the Environment, State Highway Administration, DNR, they have a huge role in many projects. And so concurrent project review, digitized process, these are pretty fundamental, simple things. And even third-party review when government doesn't have the staff or the time to meet their obligations either under the law or their own aspirations for what seems like a fair time. I think we have to collectively all, and this is even for the federal government and NEPA, whenever they reopen, but we all have to think about how we can reduce and chip away at each kind of narrow point in the process and pipeline, expand that so that things can flow at their natural pace.
Yeah, no, really well said. And it has been interesting to see, I'm on a lot of boards. It's one of my jobs. And it's been interesting to see the housing that comes to some of the boards that I'm on that I would not have guessed have any say in housing, like MALPF. The Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Board. It's fascinating to see the projects that come recently. The MALPF board voted down a project. I was the lone vote for it, and so it's it's just really challenging to see and to make sure that everybody's sort of firing on all cylinders to ensure that some of these projects get done. So let's now talk about, I think, one of the most challenging things is this whole discussion around, well, when we build new housing, we have to make sure that we have the infrastructure to support it, right? And that's true. We do. We need to have the schools. We need to have the roads. We need to have transit. We need to have sewers and wastewater treatment plants, right? And all of those things cost more and more money every year. I remember hearing when I was first running and we were meeting in Salisbury, sort of the challenge of growing Salisbury city limits to add more housing because of sewer and water and the challenges there. So I know you are in a lot of conversations about this. I would love to hear, talk to us a little bit about what you're hearing and seeing, any ideas out there on this front. Yeah,
this is I think sort of the fundamental debate, and it's almost a chicken and egg debate. What's going to come first? I think that I think that's there's a false dichotomy that's set up there. I think the reality is, of course, we need to grow and expand and maintain infrastructure while we're building housing, which is its own form of infrastructure, right? Typically not publicly owned, right? But I think it absolutely is a form of infrastructure. And so whether it's water or sewer or roads or parking, these are utilities that are necessary and that we have to have the financing tools to execute on. In a resource-constrained time, I think we've got to be really creative with what we've got. I'm a big believer that there are some tools that exist. In fact, you're the chair of the Maryland Community Investment Corporation. I serve as your vice chair, proudly serve as your vice chair. We're working together on projects, big transformative catalytic projects that the way we've arranged ourselves is to draw in outside resources, recognizing that there isn't endless government money to just build all the things we want. Another thing I'll point to is the local government infrastructure financing program at Maryland DHCD. I think this has been a really under-tapped resource when it comes to thinking about how we finance infrastructure. Ultimately, the intent of that program, the statute around that program that the General Assembly adopted, was really about public infrastructure. And so public infrastructure, including water pipes and roads and traffic signals, all those things are financeable when owned by the public. But what happens is developers and local government looks at each other and says, well, this is your problem. And they're both right. That's the really hard part about it is, the local government says, like, you're the one asking to build this thing. And the developer says, yeah, but don't you want it? and aren't you going to own the infrastructure asset
and collect the revenue?
And collect the revenue. They're both right. And so it's one of those situations where I think the state could be a better partner than we have been historically, but we're going to have to work with our partners to make sure, how do we arrange a deal in each of these scenarios that is advantageous and works for both of you? The developer is going to borrow money either way. If it's on their shoulders, they're going to borrow. And guess what? They're going to borrow it at a more expensive rate than we can lend it. Or the local government is going to have to float the bond and deal with it themselves. We'd love to be there as a better partner than we historically have been. And I think that's one example of how we can begin to lower the temperature around these infrastructure conversations and begin to problem solve with maybe a third party at the table.
Right. Yes, that is really interesting. And you're right. I'm even thinking about, MACo has a new infrastructure fund, doesn't have nearly the money it needs in it yet, but there are all these different types of ways to start thinking through some of these challenges to partner on that. So, no, well said. That's great. So thank you. Thanks for being a great partner in this work. We waited until after your needs assessment came out to sort of start drafting ours so we could take all, understand and learn from what you all did, learn from what you all have done as well. And I think, with these two reports in hand and the experiences of the people here and, a governor who understands this, a General Assembly who's dedicated to building a more affordable Maryland and local partners. I know I saw Todd Knock, the mayor, and I think president of Maryland Municipal League here. We have Delegate Kim Taylor here. We have County Council member Allison Pickard here. Did I miss any elected officials? Oh, Delegate Jamila Woods. Sorry, you're right there. I looked right at you. Thank you for being here. I think, we all understand, I think as elected officials, we want to be responsive to our constituents. And we also want to be responsive to the need that we do need to keep growing and have future constituents, right? Folks who want to live here in the state, people who we want to keep here in the state from moving. And it's this sort of policy research that we hope, it's my hope always that this kind of information can equip our policymakers to do their work and to understand where we are and what it will take to get us to where we need to be. So thank you for your partnership.
Of course, and thank you for including me in this. Thanks for having this fireside chat. It's been toasty and wonderful. I think I also just want to close out my thoughts by saying, this is complicated. There are lots of layers, right? There's not one policy we can point to. There's no silver bullet, and so we've got to have, I think, overarching objectives and clear goals and values in mind and hold fast to those, one of which I think has to be dismantling and improving upon a regulatory structure that is no longer serving the citizens of Maryland, and that we have an obligation to rethink what we've designed and what we've built. And so that's not just for the 40,000 or so 17 to 34-year-olds that left last year in the state. They want homes, to live in, starter homes. It's also about our seniors. I think we've got Jennifer Crawley, the Deputy Secretary of Maryland Department of Aging in the room. Jennifer, is she here? Yeah, hey, there she is.
There she is.
So, it's also about our seniors and thinking about the fact that many of them have more home than they need and can afford to maintain. They're stuck.
Yeah.
And so helping up and down the income range, helping, all up and down the age spectrum, this is, I think, the fundamental change we need so that every Marylander who wants to call this place home can call it.
Amen. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to continue the conversation in about 5 minutes, so you're welcome to grab a piece of cake and go back to your seat, and we'll have our panel discussion right after this. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
For
Thank
your
you all for
leadership,
being here.
Comptroller. Thank you.
My name is Dani DiPietro. I'm the Policy Research Director here at the Comptroller's Office. Obviously, a lot has already been said about this report, which I hope you'll read. I do just want to shout out my new colleague, Annie, who's in the back, our data scientist, because she contributed a ton to this report as well.
Great data.
Yeah, lots of figures, great data. Okay, so I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'll start with our sort of guest and sub-in panelist, Dom Butchko, who is here with us from MACo, filling in for Michael Sanderson, who you probably saw on the invite that you received. Thanks for being here. Lori Graf, the CEO of the Maryland Building Industry Association. Claudia Wilson Randall, the Executive Director of the Community Development Network of Maryland. And Seva Rodnyansky, the Manager of the Housing Policy Initiative at Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you for being here. So we intend to capture with this panel sort of all the perspectives that are in this report. We, as Ben mentioned, spoke with over 200 individuals and organizations in putting this report together. So we wanted to present the same balanced approach for this discussion as is captured in the report. So I'm going to pose a series of questions, and for each question, you'll have about 3 to 5 minutes to respond. And I will keep time, loosely, but we just want to foster a great conversation. So first question, and little lead-in. We know there are many challenges to building housing in Maryland, especially at a price point that residents can actually afford. The report established that Maryland's current development environment, the combinations of the fees and regulations and prolonged timelines that were discussed, sort of create a de facto price floor, which makes it quite difficult to build housing that's actually in financial reach of residents. So for our panel, if you can narrow it down for us in your perspective, what are the top 2 or 3 challenges from where you sit that drive up housing costs or inhibit supply? These can be very broad, big picture, like macroeconomic issues, or really specific regulations. Feel free to discuss any of the findings that were outlined in our report or just your experience on the ground. We'll just start with Dom, since you're to my left.
All right, so thank you, Dani. Definitely not, that is loud, oh my God. Definitely not a replacement for Michael Sanderson, but happy to be here. So for this question, I think we can break the problem down really into 2 buckets. So first, local governments, municipalities, counties, we really are creatures of the state. And so the state sets the broad direction, and then it falls on us to implement. Maryland, we are a state that is very ambitious, multiple priorities, and just a natural function of that, those priorities are now starting to compete, which leads to some consternation and issues at the local level on how do we actually implement that, what's important versus what's not important. Additionally, at the local level, we are democracies, just like the state. We are beholden to the voters, and so not only do we have to listen to the direction from the state, but then we also have to listen to the voters. And so in order to get the state and local house in order, we really need to do a lot of homework in deciding what is actually a priority, what's not, what's going to be second tier, et cetera. It's a lot of homework. I will say I'm very excited and ambitious for this coming session because for the first time in years, that homework is actually being done. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in 2026. The second side of that, though, because I said there's 2 issues, there's stuff not within the control of government. Now, regardless of your political persuasion, I think we can all look to DC right now and say that there's major changes going on, changes such as tariffs, changes such as labor that are outside of the control of the state of Maryland, of the counties, of the municipalities, et cetera. That doesn't mean that we can't, just say we don't have to deal with those, but we have to recognize that. Additionally, housing is developed by the private sector. And so just because we, relax regulation, et cetera, the private sector still has a role. So again, two buckets here. There are things that we can control, that we should control, that we're working on. We also need to be nimble and recognize the realities and set our ambitions, knowing that there's this wide universe of gray area that we can't control.
Thank you. Lori, from the developers and builders perspective, what are the key headwinds to building more?
There's a lot, so to narrow it down is somewhat complicating, but I'm going to be a little bit redundant from some of the things that I feel like the Secretary and the Comptroller live in my head, because a lot of the things that they talk about are things that we've been talking about for quite some time. I will say from the 10,000 square foot view, it's very, there's so many different things. We talked about the Smith Island cake. I do want to give a quick shout out to Eric Soder back there. He's one of our members with Rogers Consulting. He's the one that coined the phrase, and he's been talking about it for a couple of years now, so thank you to Eric. But there's so many different layers here. There's so many different things. There's not one single fix. One thing we did not talk about, and I'm sure Dominic could talk a little bit about this at some point, but is the constituents and the NIMBY attitude out there, and that is one of the biggest challenges that we see. It's mentioned in the report, how we could get through a whole part of the process, and then public comment comes in, and it's very challenging to get through that. So there's not one fix. There's going to have to be many fixes. We talk about a lot of different things. There's not going to be like one big silver bullet or anything like that, but we've got to have to start having the conversation. And I'm very excited for today because I feel like we are actually starting to have the conversation in meaningful ways. The second thing, I'm going to show you a totally different example of Smith Island cake. This is a different chart, but this is all the environmental regulations. I counted it's 18, and then that does not include some specific ones for each jurisdiction. So you're getting to 20, 25 different environmental regulations. By no stretch of the imagination are we looking to harm the environment, but all of these, on top of all the other things, really adds up to cost and time, which is the biggest challenge that we see in development. I was just in a meeting the other day, and this is kind of talking a little bit about the education that we just need to do, but I had an elected official from a jurisdiction tell me and a group of developers, you guys don't want to build affordable housing. You guys don't want to build anything that's affordable. You just want to do the luxury stuff. And I was like, took great offense to that, because that's not the case. We really do want to build more affordable products, but once you get to the time and all of this and the $90,000 to $100,000 worth of regulations that you have to put into a house before you even put a piece of lumber in the ground adds up. And it's very challenging to build anything that's attainable in Maryland because of all of those regulations and the time that it takes. And I'm just going to make one more point, and this was talked about in the Fireside Chat, is investment. We can't build anything without investment. There's nobody in our industry, or very few people, I guess, or maybe some, that do things on cash basis. You've got to be able to invest. You've got to be able to get investors that look at a project and say, this makes sense, we can get a return on our investment. And that goes for affordable housing developers, nonprofit developers. Everybody needs investment. And when you have all of the regulations on top of all of the regulations and the late vesting, where things can change at any moment, it makes it very challenging for investment in the state of Maryland. So.
Thanks, Lori. Claudia, what are the roadblocks from your perspective?
So I'm going to try to be shorter than my colleagues because I think they've said some of the things that I'm going to say. I want to really center people in my remarks. What people in the state of Maryland need is opportunity and economic growth. And in order to do that, we have got to figure this out. And I just would go along with some of the economics of what has previously been mentioned. That's what I would say as well. But we can't only just talk about the buildings and the subsidy and all that's needed. We've got to focus on what people need, and they need economic growth, and they need economic opportunity. And so really thinking about how we accelerate the production of housing, period, in the state of Maryland is vital for the economy and for us to grow the economy. Housing is critical infrastructure for the state of Maryland, and we have to think of it as critical infrastructure. And I just can't emphasize enough that people want economic opportunity. They want a place to be able to raise their family. They want a place to be educated. They want growth. And our state has been pretty stagnant in growth. So this is a key piece for the state of Maryland. And I just want to center people and their lives. And when we talk about the other challenges that the state has, health, education, we can't get there without housing. So I just put that out there. The second point that I made is, for me, this challenge is going to take sustained attention. It is not 1 year. It is, as you said, it's not a silver bullet, but it's also not a 1 year thing. We need to figure out how to, this year, next year, and keep going, because it's not going to be solved in a single cycle, right? Or with a single elected official. It's gonna take sustained investment, and we're gonna have to grow. Hey, we found a way to do this. How do we do it in another county? How do we do it in another area? Urban, suburban, rural. It's critical that we have focus on this over a longer time horizon. And I think that's just hard with policy. I think it's easy for people to kind of get, thinking about a single year, but it's gonna take attention over a long time horizon. Thank you.
Thank you. And Seva, just curious if these are the same issues you see nationally, and anything that was said unique to Maryland, or just hope you can provide that national perspective.
Thanks again for having me, and just want to call out both the Comptroller and DHCD for insightful and incisive data-driven analysis, and I think that's really helpful, and I think for everybody in the room and all of my panelists. So I'm the research manager of a small group at the Pew Charitable Trusts that works on looking at policies and research to provide safe and accessible housing financing, as well as increase the availability and affordability of housing. So that's broad, but a lot of work we do is with states and then nationally as well. And so taking that perspective, I want to kind of echo actually what Claudia was saying, and this is beyond units or numbers or FARs or variances, right? This is about people, families, households, whatever you want to call them, and what they want. And I think periodically there's actually confusion about what the public wants. But we've done a variety of survey work, and dozens of other organizations have done sophisticated surveys, and all of them pretty much show that housing is a bipartisan issue and one of the most bipartisan. It shows today that the public is so broadly supportive of all housing, all types, apartments, ADUs, townhomes, single-family homes, anything. And that's across party lines, that's across incomes, that's across ages, that's across renters versus homeowners. I mean, you name it. I can send you lots of info on that. Again, a room full of housing or housing adjacent people, probably not so surprising, but I think we need to take that info as we go into project by project, into the field and into the policy world. And why are they saying that? Why are they so positive on this? Well, affordability, that was brought up earlier today, but also people living closer to jobs, closer to schools, closer to shops, closer to the bus stop, living closer to family, helping local businesses. This is all reasons, 70%, 80% of people say all that, right? So just centering the people, I think, is very helpful as we have these discussions. Moreover, pro-housing is pro-people, and the places that don't do this, new projects or even renovations, they require going to 15 different departments, understanding 77 different regulations. That's not unique to Maryland. A lot of places have that. And it's hard to call places like that open to growth, open to more, open to housing, any way you call it, open to people even. But the places that have pursued, been successful and meaningful in increasing housing supply and other approaches, they've taken holistic views. It's not just this, it's this one thing. If I can kind of tamp that down, it'll get better, right? Because you run into a whack-a-mole situation, or it's that department. No. It's got to be concerted, it's got to be holistic, and it's got to be with goals in mind. And places like Minneapolis, Austin, and others have done this multi-year, multi-phase way of doing this. And one more challenge, and maybe not a challenge, but informative kind of data point I want to bring, is that household sizes in the US and Maryland also are lower than people think. They're about 2.5 people per household. Now, it's a whole distribution. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics, but it's lower than it's pretty much ever been. And not only that, but about 63% of households have 1 or 2 people. Great. That's the facts on the ground. It's not really reversing. Why are we encouraging 4-bedroom, 2,500 plus square feet for all? Those are great solutions when needed, but it needs to be more than that.
Thank you, everyone. The next question is, so the report identifies primarily in the conclusion and also in some of the case studies, promising steps that have been taken both in Maryland and across the country to address affordability and production challenges. What are you seeing that has worked from your experience working in Maryland, or what you've observed in our neighboring states or sort of competitor states, those we're losing residents to? And we'll just go in reverse this time if that works.
Great, it's me again. All right, I want to talk about 3 things. We talk about a lot of them, but I think 3 stand out. One, from our research and other groups, policymakers, people on the ground, one of the most of any reforms, building apartment buildings along major corridors and in transit areas and in commercial areas nets you the most units. That has been kind of time and time again, place and place again, apartments and transit corridors, shopping areas, transit areas. Again, not news to people living in various parts of Maryland, but doing that again and again gets you a lot of bang for your buck. And places that are making it easier, Texas, Arizona, Montana, you're like, okay, maybe we're not like them, but also Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and that's just in 2025. Other places have done that in other years, right? So there is active legislation and past legislation that can be looked toward. Not only that, but one strong enabler of doing this well, efficiently, and multiple times is parking reform. Doing this well and parking reform together is good. And again, places like Minneapolis and Austin have used these policies effectively. 2 other things. Everyone says building is very costly. Building new stuff is very costly. It is. So what are the ways where we actually could lower costs of new construction or substitute, right? So in some cases, embracing factory-built housing, such as manufactured homes by right, and including in built-up places, not just far-out greenfield, as well as modular building, as real cost and time, and at times permitting advantages if you can do it right. And there's a homegrown example here in Hagerstown, Maryland. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a new neighborhood that's all manufactured homes that's just open. I think there was a demonstration about 6 months ago. If you think that those are mobile homes of yesteryear, you should take a drive and take a look. These are, I'd want to live there, right? And I rent, so I definitely want to live there, right? And the third thing is streamlined permitting. Again, everybody had mentioned that, but I think there's multiple ways that it's been approached. Like Secretary Day said, third-party review, that's been done recently in Georgia and Arizona. Pre-approved plans, so kind of reducing some of the costs in getting housing built, especially for smaller nonprofit developers. That's being done in Oregon and Arizona. And then revising participation to the planning process, which is very important, but perhaps moving toward planning rather than project by project. And I think Montana is taking that on, bringing visibility and accountability to permitting times, especially for by right projects.
You've stolen some of my thunder. But I would just echo what you're saying about modular housing. As a matter of fact, the project that you're describing in Hagerstown was part of the Community Development Week. tour that we did last year. And this represents innovation in the field of housing, and I think it's really important that people kind of see it for what it is in 2025 and not think about 1975 mobile homes, right? But to think about some of the innovation that's been in the housing industry in terms of building, and I do think that is also an opportunity for Maryland to have a new industry around building and the creation of that. We see that in Pennsylvania and adjacent states, and I do think that that's an exciting innovation that can be brought to this subject that is really important. The other thing I'm gonna just take the liberty to talk about is advocacy and talking, like, we've got to talk to people about how affordable housing means to our own people, not someone else. This isn't about someone else. This is about your mother. This is about your aunt. This is about your cousin who's on Social Security and disability. This is about people, the tutor. This is about your X-ray technician. I mean, I'm just sitting here with my gray hair, but all of us are gonna need an X-ray technician. And gosh, wouldn't it be amazing for that person to have an opportunity to own a house? That's what we're talking about. This isn't about someone else. And I think the work also that we have to do is also not always macro, but it's sometimes micro. And when we have this groundswell of opposition around housing, I say, gee, that person who tutors your child in school, where should they live? What opportunities should that school tutor have? And why are, like, I get that we're in a time of anger and upset and acrimony and all the isms, but I'm just thinking, what about you? Where should your child's teacher live? Where should the pharmacy tech who just filled your prescription, where should they live? Let's really breaking it down and really having some of those small conversations that we can all of you, every church, every basketball league, every recreation center, you can all have these conversations that begin to push the needle in a different direction for communities. And I will also have to say that I am also at the time where I also believe that there may be counties in our state that are not with us right now, and that's okay. We gotta let it go. And we've gotta make progress with the counties that wanna make progress. So I think I see other states doing that effectively. Minnesota is one where they started in one direction and some folks weren't on board, but as they've had success, other counties have come on board. So I think that's the greatest way for us to make progress.
I'm going to build a little bit on both of those points. So I just always think of, I was at a dinner a couple of years ago with a girlfriend of mine who's not in the industry, and she's like, when are you guys going to stop building houses? I'm tired of all the traffic. So we sat down, we're having a glass of wine or whatever, and so I had this whole conversation about the same exact thing you're talking about. Like, okay, your taxes are gonna go up, and people aren't gonna be able to live here. So it's a word of mouth. It's education. It's making sure it's arming our elected officials with the information so that when you guys have those tough conversations, people can really understand what you guys are talking about. And then just to answer the question and build off of what Seva talked about, we've seen a lot of those things happen around the country, and there is other studies that show that they actually do reduce rent and make things more affordable. I think it's, for every, I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but every 3% growth, I think 2% your rent goes down, those types of things. So there's all sorts of studies out there that show this does work. I get that a lot in the General Assembly. How do we know if this is actually gonna work? There are studies out there that show, especially Austin, Texas, is just a prime example that a lot of people use. They built a lot more, and housing prices do go down. And so that's a dichotomy that I wanted to point out. As far as Maryland, we have certainly seen some movement, the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act. We just passed some legislation on accessory dwelling units and other things. I think it's a little too early to measure those and see if they're really working. But I do look forward to trying to figure out if we can other incremental changes that we can make to try to move the ball forward.
All right, so I'm on cleanup duty. All right, so first at the local level, there's a lot of really unique and interesting experimentation going on that really just, it makes me positive, and it's cool to see government work. So I'm gonna pick on Montgomery County, for example. You might remember recently they were in the New York Times because Montgomery County, land of milk and honey, they were able to actually invest in a lot of projects in a very unique way and actually have a hand in how do we actually develop the assets themselves. But for the jurisdictions that don't have that, we're seeing still an incredible amount of experimentation. In Prince George's County, they are probably the tip of the spear in the right of first refusal movement, which is basically how do we leverage government, public and private dollars to ensure that not only are we developing new housing stock, but we're preserving the affordable housing stock that we have today. Frederick County, there's a lot of conversation right now about zoning. It was said probably 20 times. Frederick County is actually experimenting in certain areas with regulation and what could we take away, how will the market react, et cetera, setbacks, density. And so we actually have jurisdictions experimenting with what's the status quo, how can we change it. Baltimore City, I'm gonna pick on you right now. I cannot open up the news without you doing something on housing. You're one of the busiest people that I've seen on the housing front at the local level. So we see a lot of really interesting stuff going on. At the state level now, let's turn, 2026, this is probably going to be one of the biggest issues. In 2024, the state created a new definition, a qualified project, a new tool that said we are going to designate certain projects that give such a special public good that we are going to treat those differently. And they had certain levels of affordability and they had to be within certain locations, et cetera. We're looking at how do we expand that definition because those qualified projects do give a public good, and how can we encourage the development of the units that we want to see? And one of the biggest things we're hearing, and we talked about it in the previous panel, a lot of the housing that's going up right now is more upper class housing, is rich housing. So how can we encourage the development in the areas that we need to see grow?
Thank you, everyone. Super insightful. I do want to add a little bonus question, and specifically something you said, Seva. I feel parking restrictions and traffic, really hot topics. Can you talk a little bit more about the places that have made that work? Did the sky fall? Did it go okay? Does it make a big difference in terms of keeping project costs down and enhancing density?
The sky did not fall. It rains sometimes, some of those places. But I think, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar, there's a glossy book that came out about 20 years ago called The High Cost of Free Parking, and Donald Shoup, professor at UCLA that passed away a while back, I had the chance to meet him a few times. His basic premise is that, we have a lot of very different parking regulations and that some variation on how effective there are. Fast forward to today, a lot of places have noted that, that they require much more parking than is used and likely than is needed. And while maybe not the most expensive part of a project, is certainly an expensive part of the project, regardless of whether that's ADU, single family, row house, townhome, et cetera, apartment buildings. And so places that have done that successfully have really supercharged where they can. And these vary from Seattle, very high growth, high income, to Buffalo, lower income, lower growth, right? And they have unlocked units that would not have been there. And I think either Comptroller Lierman or Secretary Day said, well, we're not seeing all the units and all the projects that would have been built had these regulations, or particular regulations, not been there. Well, same thing now with the places that have rolled back the parking. They are now seeing them, and it's no longer a conversation. And it's, generally speaking, also improved their street utilization. It's improved their transit utilization. Sometimes you can monetize the parking revenue in a more efficient way, right? There's some knock-on effects for both kind of planning as well as the economy from that.
I have nothing to add on parking.
I don't really have anything on parking, but I will say I do hear over and over again that we talked about the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act, which offers bonus density. One of the challenges that I hear over and over again from our members is we can't get the density we're already supposed to get. So bonus density doesn't really excite a lot of us for a lot of reasons, and it's partly because of the parking requirements or the forest or all the other things that take up space on land that you can't get what you're already supposed to get. So a bonus density isn't really that helpful in a lot of cases when we have all the other stuff there's only so much, we can't make more land. There's only so much space to put all the stuff we have to put on because of all the regulations, and parking would be one of them.
All right, so that's a lot to unpack. So I'm going to try and be as concise as possible here. So this is a big issue. It's complex. There's a lot of facets. I think Lori's point gets to my point earlier, where we have competing priorities, and both the state and local government have to do a better job at realigning what those are. The state needs to take direction, but we certainly need to follow their direction. The other side on parking, it's a complicated issue. The one thing I will say, local jurisdictions right now, counties in particular, are under immense pressure in our current fiscal climate. Highway user revenues, these are the funds that fund our transportation infrastructure, our roads. Our share of those are set to basically go off a cliff in the next fiscal year or two. And so we are really strained for resources around transportation. How do we get people from A to B? How do we get the fire trucks and the ambulances where they need to go without being interrupted? We need to have a deeper and bigger conversation. Depending on the community, revisiting parking should definitely be a part of that. But the communities are so diverse, the situations on the ground are so diverse, we just have to have that in the back of our minds as we're having these conversations in an environment like Annapolis.
Thank you, and perfect segue. The last question is about finding that right balance between our values as a state and as local government. So as a state, we obviously care deeply about protecting the environment, about protecting workers, about local control, and have laws and regulations accordingly that are intended to be good for individuals' health and the economy and quality of life. At the same time, we need more housing, and housing that's more affordable, and sometimes those things are at odds. So just wanted to have this last question, pretty general. From your perspective, how do we strike that right balance? Are we there now? What might the path look like to get there? And I'll just go back down the line if you're up for it.
All right, yeah. Ending strong. Okay. So again, I actually have in my notes, big question. Like this is like, what are we going to do? To your end part there, are we currently striking the balance? I don't think we would be having this report. I don't think I would be up here. I don't think my colleagues would be up here if we are striking the right balance. So that's clearly no. I'm going to go back to the thing I said, like, this is going to be the third time now. We need clear direction from the state. I am very optimistic because those conversations are happening right now. I think we're going to see a lot of ambitious, important change in 2026. But local governments need clear direction and clear marching orders from the state on what's actually a priority and how do we implement it versus what can we pause or what can we tone down and for how long, et cetera. One thing I will say, though, when we are having these conversations, Maryland, even though we're very, very small, we're incredibly geographically diverse. MACo has been really deep on this housing issue. One of the blessings of my job, I get to go all across the state, all 24 counties, and they really are different. And one thing that's very clear is the issues that are impacting the Baltimore, D.C. region, Maryland's urban core, are night and day different from the issues that are impacting Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, and the Eastern Shore. In the more rural areas, the biggest issues is septics, and a lot of that is at the state level. How do we regulate those? How do we approve those? How do we fix those, et cetera? Septics aren't going to be as big of an issue in Montgomery County and Baltimore City, et cetera. And how do we, expand certain regulations? What matters? What doesn't matter? One of the things we're looking at in 2024, we updated our forest conservation laws, and part of that we had an alternative compliance for multifamily. But it's just multifamily; it has no financial component, et cetera. So how can we we've already said we're going to make certain compromises here and there. How do we expand those? Additionally, and my colleagues from Montgomery will yell at me if I don't don't say this. We need to get really creative on financing. Financing is really important. How do we leverage our tax code? How do we use the tools at the local level? How do we encourage the development in the income brackets and the AMI that we want to, versus areas that we might be able to take a little bit more burden because we still have to supply all of those infrastructure and resources, et cetera. But one thing I will say, the geographic regions are different, the issue is complex, and we really need to get this right.
So I'm gonna push back a little bit on Dominic and don't punch me. They sat us sitting next to each other. We're sitting in this room here. We're talking about all these great housing policies. You talked a lot about some of the great housing policies that some jurisdictions are doing, which is amazing. But we still spend a tremendous amount of our time as an association fighting local regulations that are going to make it harder to build housing. You had the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act. We had some local jurisdictions that pushed back on that and changed laws to make it more difficult to build in those particular certain circumstances. I am sure I'll spend probably 75% of my time between January and April fighting regulations that's going to make it, laws that are going to make it harder to build housing. So I think we do need to find a balance, but we really need to, as we start not adding to that Smith Island cake, we need to start looking at it, evaluating it, but we got to stop adding to it and start seeing what we can do to fix the problems that we've created in the past, but at the same time, stop adding to it. And that's one of the challenges that we currently see, and we've got to find that balance.
Skinny cake.
I would like to see prioritized housing, what I think of as housing and. That piece that helps us improve health, improve education, and strike that right balance there. I think that when we're centering the lives of Marylanders and creating opportunity for Marylanders, that's where the balance is, in my view. I also think we have to prioritize acceleration, right? We've got to go faster than we've been going. And I agree with Dominic that we haven't found the right balance. But we got to figure out how to go back faster, right? Because if you accept the premise that we're in a crisis, well, we're going to have to do something extraordinary, right? We can't just we can't just ride along in the right lane, not passing, we've got to figure out how to go faster, at least for a few years. And again, this may be a 10-year plan for us to go faster, but we're going to have to do some things that are extraordinary and that make the housing process and the regulation burden lighter so that we can go faster. I would also say that the challenges that the state has, rising Medicare cost of education, the blueprint, right, are also connected to this. We're never going to have a successful school if 25% of the kids there are getting evicted. It's never gonna work. So we gotta figure out how those kids don't get evicted. How do we stabilize? I would also say the infrastructure question that is being raised by Dominic and others is real. And let's figure out how do we start floating bonds just for infrastructure in certain areas, and it benefits all of the multifamily and the single family and the stores and retail, right? We gotta figure that out. It's the only way you also get urban, rural, and suburban, development, I think, going. But that infrastructure issue is real, and it's a real challenge, and there's no magical thinking that's gonna make the infrastructure challenge go away.
So balance in all of this, obviously very important. We get this question a lot from Maryland to Minnesota to Montana, wherever you look. And ultimately each state and each locale is gonna make decisions or sets of decisions, solutions appropriate to their context. We recently completed kind of a year-long process where we were talking to stakeholders on all sides of the housing issue to say, okay, well, what can we agree? People who generally agree that there's a housing shortage, generally agree that housing is a good thing and that we want people housed. We want people housed in places where they can somewhat afford to live. And so 60 plus, I think, or 70 plus different organizations and individuals from the far right to the far left, from the activist to the academic to the practitioner, came together on a set of shared principles on housing that can guide toward better inclusive policy. There's 4. They're pretty simple, but I think it kind of talks to the balance question. 1, enabling more of all housing types. We've all said it, but again, including smaller, less expensive options. 2, and I think it's very important in the Maryland context, right, is avoiding inflexible mandates to do something, right? 3, spurring creation of apartments and condo buildings and townhomes in high-use areas, right? Places where people already are, already want to be. There's already amenities. And 4, generally lowering administrative barriers. Not as a specific, you do this, you do that, but generally, if we lower the administrative barriers, you're going to get more housing. It's going to get easier, cheaper, faster. And we've had very good reception. It's hard for people to argue against these basic balance principles. There's devils in the details, but that already builds a bridge that you're starting from somewhere, not nowhere.
Thank you. That's all the pre-prepared questions. If anyone has anything that they didn't get to say that they really want to say, I'm happy to have folks do some closing thoughts in any order. If not, we will go into Q&A. Great, easy. So if anyone has a question in the audience, just raise your hand, and Ben will come around with the microphone. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Michael Greenspun, developer, primarily work in Baltimore County. And Seva, you said at the beginning in your remarks that when you poll people, they cross both parties. They're very interested in all kinds of housing, very supportive of that. And I would agree with that. But the problem I have and see is that when you ask those same people, do you want this development next to you, behind you, across the street from you, the answer suddenly becomes absolutely not, for a myriad of reasons. And they're very vocal, the NIMBYs, as Lori referred to, and they have the ear of the council people in Baltimore County. And I've seen the council people overturn, deny, pass laws to kill off projects, on top of passing all kinds of legislation to just make development more expensive in any way they can come up with. And until that is overcome at the county level, I don't see much progress happening. So my question basically is, how can the state try and overcome this NIMBY-centric council situation and get the council people, who should be the adults in the room, to understand what they're doing to their county?
Appreciate the question. I'll take a stab or two, and I'm sure my panelists, fellow panelists, would take a stab too. Listen, it's true. Once you ask people, do you want more housing? Do you want more apartment buildings do you want more transit-oriented development? However you ask it, 80% yes, regardless of who. You ask the question, do you want that housing even a 2-flat or a 4-flat next door? Sport drops to 50%, not nothing, but 50%. That's pretty good. When you then ask the question is, well, what if it had a corner store and maybe, a little this and that? Sport goes up. What if it was on the avenue instead of on the cul-de-sac? All of a sudden it's 65%, right? So there are products and places where it's easier, but I don't have to tell you that. You're the developer. I think in terms of what other states especially have done with this, right? NIMBYism isn't going away, regardless of kind of what we do here, but there are places that have passed policies, right? There's, just this week, California's SB 79 that grants by right approval, ministerial approval to kind of medium density apartment buildings within a certain corridor of transit throughout the state, right? Texas has done similar things. Oregon has done similar things, right? There are places that have done it kind of on zoning. There are other places that have done it on various approvals or have said, okay, you do what you want, but if it's not approved, if the typical permit's not approved in 90 days, then, we're pulling such and such funding. So I do think that there's a variety of options. Which specific ones are perfect for Maryland? That's not my job, right? But I do think there are other states have led with this, including on tough thorny questions like you've asked.
If in the report, it actually, I'm going to bring it back to your report. It talks a little bit about changing when public input can be given, and I think if we moved it to more of like the master plan, we've talked a little bit more about comprehensive plan process as opposed to project specific. I think that would help a little bit with that issue. So the report references that definitely.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm just an ordinary citizen here, but I'm going to tell you about my neighborhood, Arundel. We have so many empty houses, and I'm telling you, about a third of the houses in my little neighborhood never have had a permanent family living in them, and I know this is true in many suburban areas. How can these unoccupied houses be turned around so that it is affordable housing for people? These are small houses. They're not the mansions along the water. Ideas, please.
All right, so I'm gonna jump on this one first. I'll take this grenade, guys. So that is actually something that MACo has been looking at really, really deeply. So you have two issues there. You either have short-term rentals or you have it's an investment property and you're looking at dumping it sometime in the future for a profit. We're probably going to be coming with it's going to be no surprise to anybody, we're probably coming with a legislative package on housing. And in that package is going to be a series of tools to address this, making sure that when we want to encourage home ownership, we're making sure we're encouraging it for the demographics that we want, the workers that Claudia was talking about, et cetera. Making sure that in a walkable community like Annapolis, that we're not being overrun with short-term rentals and that we have the tools to regulate this. It's a multi-pronged issue. It's not an easy one. It's not a simple one, but it is one we can fix.
I will say that there are other counties throughout the state also who have been working on land banking and other vacant strategies that are, that Anne Arundel and other areas could take on.
I'll also just note in the report, there's a interesting analysis of vacancy by the census definition, which includes seasonal and second homes, blighted and abandoned properties, and vacancy meaning for sale and for rent units that are available. So you could sort of see by county what that looks like.
Can I jump in again? One of the proudest things that I was able to do at my time at MACo was in the 2024 session, we passed a vacancy tax that was enabling statewide. So whether you're in Anne Arundel or whether you're in Baltimore City or whether you're in a municipality, local jurisdictions have the ability to use their tax authority for the first time to target those areas. So it's a piece of it, and we're going to work at it harder, but we're starting.
Excellent job. Sorry, Victor Akanabi, developer. I got the mic in the back. So first, great panel and great content. I just had a couple of questions, and I'll keep it quick. So the first thing is actually to dovetail on the abandoned properties or properties that need to be utilized. Has there ever been any thought about kind of correlating buyers to developers? And I ask that because we're a builder, we'll finish a house, we'll list it for sale, and it would be super awesome if, state of Maryland had like a resource where people are going to sign up and say, hey, I'm interested in an affordable house, and then kind of have like a matchmaking portion where it's kind of like a state-run asset, if you will. So, it's the first if there's a thought. And then the second on permits, and this is a topic that we all love, but actually regulation around permits. So in the state of Idaho, they actually have a program called like a residential master electrician, a residential plumber, where you can go to school for just 12 months, 6 months, and actually get the ability to pull permits. This is a state level thing versus in the state of Maryland. It's actually easier to fly a 777 jet than it is to earn your master's license. 5 years to get the 777 jet license and 7 years to become a master electrician. So that's the second one. And then the third, is banking partnership. So as a builder, we're knife fighting with pick your major bank, Bank of America, PNC, Wells Fargo. And again, it would be great if the state had an exchange of approved builders where it's like, hey, we can help you, which the BVRI program is kind of like that, but again, a matchmaking process for banks to extend lines of credit to small and medium-sized developers. So sorry for the diatribe.
I actually think those are all good ideas and worth exploring. The work on the matchmaking and ready buyers for properties, that is something that we've also discussed. The Community Development Network has talked about how specifically our nonprofit members would market that to ready buyers for owner-occupied, as well as small developers. I think that's a great idea. I also think your idea about thinking about how the capital match is something that's a product that is sort of recurring theme that we hear about how to access capital for development in that process. I do think that the housing migration and economy and sort of the many layers of banking challenges right now also add to that. But yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Just real quick on the workforce, this is a huge challenge for our industry that we really haven't talked about, and it's not really mentioned that much in the report. But I can survey my members on any given year, and workforce is certainly one of the top 3 issues every single year. We've really worked hard to start getting out there more and getting to the community colleges, getting to the high schools. We just had a site tour. I don't know if Jim Schaefer's still here. Jim, we just had a site tour in Southern Maryland yesterday. We brought a bunch of high school students in that are interested in learning how to build housing. One thing I've learned recently that I think is a big challenge for a lot of these programs is residential versus commercial. And that's really challenging to get people to go into the residential side of things. That's financial reasons and other things, and just being there. The commercial sector is definitely out there recruiting and doing more on that side. So we're certainly trying to get more out there. I'm trying to get a meeting with the Secretary of Labor to talk more about that, because I do think we could make it easier to get into the industry. It is a huge challenge. I have an 8th grader who I am pushing. I'm like, you should be an electrician. You should go into this. But he's hard not to crack. But those are the things that we should be talking about more. And I know Blueprint does a little bit of that as far as your career ready. But we certainly should be talking a lot more about workforce and how to get more people easier, especially into the residential side, because that is a huge, huge challenge.
So I'll jump in here last. So on the abandoned properties, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we've delved pretty deeply into. So one of the weird things about law, and I don't want to get too deep because my eyes will glaze over, your eyes will glaze over, it won't end well, but LLC transparency. So when you buy a property, you put it under an LLC. If you own that LLC, you can just disappear. You don't have to have a contact information with the state. You don't have to have any information. You can just create it and boom, you're gone. And if you're a landlord, you can just keep taking the check, but no one really has anyone to talk to. One of the biggest issues that we have with the abandoned property is getting through that LLC transparency, having to put the property up for tax sale. Alice, no, you worked on the bill with me in 24. Preach. So if we're going to go after abandoned properties, we need to do some dramatic things with our corporation laws, our corporate laws, et cetera. And that actually is a pretty big hurdle in the General Assembly. Again, just going after how complicated housing policy is. You wouldn't think LLC laws are attached to our abandoned property issue, but that's probably the biggest impediment to why we're not seeing more development in the city.
We've worked on this for almost 10 years, maybe more. The LLC transparency, we've been talking about this, since.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up, because that question, three-part question, I think really demonstrated how many different stakeholders it will take to sort of look at this holistically and solve this problem. So thank you, and thank you so much to the panelists. I also couldn't help but think when we're closing out on workforce a little bit, my mind just goes to, okay, well, making sure that workforce can afford to live here is also going to be, a critical central piece to all this. So thanks again, and just so many of you in this room have spent a lot of time with me over the past 6 months on the phone, on email, so just sincere gratitude, and thank you. I'll turn it to
Thank you for all your work on this, Dani.
Thank you, everyone. Just real briefly as we wrap up here, just want to thank you all for coming out. I especially just want to thank Dani and Annie, who are the lead authors on this report. They did a fantastic job. And I also just want to thank Adam Abadir and our communications team that put this whole event together today. We really encourage you to take a look at the report. I think, we really just scratched the surface today. This is intended to be the beginning of the conversation, not the end. The report is just chock full of examples of what we're seeing in Maryland and comparing what we are seeing here with other states. And it really dives deep into examples as it relates to appeals processes, as it relates to impact fees, and a whole host of issues. So we encourage folks to take a look. And I'll just end on the following. As we were doing research for this report, we came across a hearing with a faculty member from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University named Michael Wasilenko, who was talking about not Maryland, but another higher cost state in the general region similar to Maryland. And what he said really stuck with us, and it was that changing housing policy, more so than anything else, more so than tax policy, more so than business incentives, more so than pretty much any policy at the state or local level you can come up with, can significantly increase economic competitiveness. And what he said is that if we can increase housing production in this unnamed state, and we can decrease costs, then we can really outcompete our neighbors, we can drive up our population, we can improve economic opportunities, and we can really position our state to thrive for everyone. So that was something that we really took to heart, and hopefully with this report and with DHCD's report on the housing needs assessment update, we can really inform policy change here in Maryland at the local level. And then just finally, want to thank Scott and Secretary Day and their team for being partners with us in doing this. Secretary Day calls Scott a housing nerd, which is what he is. We are not housing nerds, but we learned a lot in working with him, and hopefully that's reflected in this report. So a couple pieces of cake left. Hang around. We have this room for a little longer. Do some networking, and thank you all for being here.